and implementation for bilateral relationships with Turkey, Cyprus, and Greece, and also as the director of the Office of Press and Public Diplomacy for Europe. She also served at U.S. embassies in Kabul, Afghanistan, Zagreb, Croatia, Yerevan, Armenia, Almaty, Kazakhstan, Tunis, Tunisia, and Port-au-Prince, Haiti. She speaks French, Russian, Croatian, and some Spanish and Arabic. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Vivian Walker.
Thank you. Thank you, and thank you for the introduction. And you can all hear me, right? Good. You've got a little bit of my bio, but I want to explain a little bit more about what brings me here today to talk about strategic communication, public diplomacy, and branding Ukraine. I was a public diplomacy officer for 26 years with the Department of State. So as a public diplomacy professional, I looked at strategic communication issues in Central Asia, in the Caucasus, in Haiti, in North Africa. And then toward the end of my career, I started teaching at the National War College first, and now with the National Defense College of the UAE, where I became a teacher of strategic studies, and I began to take on the effort of trying to teach what I had practiced for many years. I actually do have a doctorate. The doctorate, however, is, as one of my sons once said many years ago, a doctorate in reading books. I have a doctorate in literature from the University of Chicago. But that interest in teaching and my interest in the profession of public diplomacy brings me here today to talk about, to bring the two together to you. So today I've been asked to talk about branding Ukraine and looking at it as an exercise in public diplomacy. Really what this lecture is about is public diplomacy, strategic communication, and branding or nation branding, which is really the application of brand management theory to improve a national image or standing, is part of public diplomacy. So we will be talking about nation branding, but we are going to approach it as part and parcel of what you do in public diplomacy. So what is public diplomacy, officially speaking, the public diplomacy of a nation? It is the attempt to inform and influence audiences outside of your country, audiences abroad, in order to bring them around to support the pursuit of your national strategic objectives and interests. So the idea is to inform and influence people of other countries in the service of your own strategic objectives. So public diplomacy is about diplomacy, it's about information, and it's about the place where diplomacy and information meet. Well, you can't have a discussion about public diplomacy, about strategic communication, about branding a nation without acknowledging, as we say in English, the 900-pound elephant in the room, the incredible narrative, the incredible strategic messaging challenge that you have in Ukraine today. You are in the midst of a conflict, a war waged by Russia, by Putin. And one thing is true, I think it's safe to say that today, Putin does control the narrative. Whether the narrative is that his aggression in Ukraine is part of his attempt to prevent the West from further encroaching on the East, an attempt to destabilize the efforts of regional unity that EU and NATO represent, or another one of his narratives is that Ukraine itself represents a threat to Russia. I'm not here today to talk about these narratives, painful as they are, but I'm here to tell you that one of the most important things about public diplomacy is controlling the narrative. And Ukraine needs to start to control its own narrative. In the short term, that means getting out the facts, telling the truth, dealing with the misinformation, which your Ministry of Information and Foreign Affairs and Defense are doing. But in the long term, controlling the narrative is about projecting a Ukraine that is not a victim merely of Russia, but a Ukraine that is strong, a Ukraine that is a viable strategic partner to other countries, other institutions, other entities in the world. That's what I mean about controlling the narrative. And our discussion today about public diplomacy, strategic communication, and nation branding really is, in effect, about that effort. So what I'm going to do today is give you some theoretical background about public diplomacy, about soft power, go through some examples of public diplomacy, and then talk about branding Ukraine. So I said that part of the most important aspect of controlling the narrative for Ukraine is to project a Ukraine that is a strong, viable partner for the future. That has to do with Ukraine's soft power. Can you all see the screen? Okay. Now, the concept of soft power is very important when we're talking about public diplomacy and strategic communication. And here you have a definition provided to us by Joseph Nye in his book, Public Diplomacy and Soft Power. He says the soft power of a country rests primarily on three resources. Its culture, in places where the culture is attractive to others, its political values, when it lives up to them at home and abroad, and its foreign policies, when they are seen as legitimate and having moral authority. So, a country's culture, its political values, and its policies. That makes up the sort of soft power attractiveness of a country. The images that I've put up on the screen here are images that when Westerners think about Ukraine, these are some of the images that come to mind. And they are associated with culture, they're associated with political values and foreign policies. And they are positive associations, and they are negative associations, such as Chernobyl. And then there is the recognition of the tragedies, for example, that have befallen Ukraine in the past, like the Holodomor. A little more about the relationship between information and power. Yoda, and I think you recognize him, says it all. Powerful information is. And the basic relationship between information and power, and the basic impetus for public diplomacy, strategic communication, and nation branding efforts is to get others to want the outcomes you want, to get others to support your strategic objectives, to get others to support your country, to get, if you're a company, others to buy what? Your product. But soft power is more than just persuasion, as Nye tells us, or the ability to move people by argument. It is also the ability to entice and to attract. In other words, the ultimate goal of soft power is not simply to argue somebody into the ground until they have no other counter-argument. The point is to make them come over to your side, to be attracted by whatever it is that you're projecting. Another important thing to understand about soft power is that it arises largely from the values a country has or an organization has. In other words, when I was messaging officially for the United States as a spokesperson, and I was talking about a particular issue, the way I talked about the issue inevitably reflected what the fundamental values of my country were. Whether it came down to freedom of speech or religious tolerance or prosperity for all, your fundamental values end up being part of the message that you send out. Now, there's nothing wrong with it. On the contrary, it's to be expected, But you need to recognize that when you do engage in these kinds of soft power activities, you are projecting these values. And you also need to be prepared for the fact that the audience to which you are projecting these messages or these ideas may not have the same value system. And sometimes, in fact, often, strategic messaging fails when the originators of strategic messages don't think through the implications of the value systems of their target audiences. So this is why I raised the point, because we'll come back to this. And finally, and this may seem obvious, but I think it's worth repeating, public diplomacy is public diplomacy. If it were simply a matter of government-to-government communications, well, I probably wouldn't be here lecturing to you about the complexities of public diplomacy. Public diplomacy, strategic communication, is challenging precisely because the publics of other countries. Now, why is that challenging? Can anyone tell me? What's that? Right, well, good. That's part of it. Anyone else?
Can you repeat your question?
What is challenging about communicating to publics of other countries?
Many people have many different opinions about the topic.
Many opinions, many different audiences. Yes?
You should take into account their culture, their mentality, traditions, because you can damage relations with that country and people.
Absolutely. And even in one country, is it one united audience? No. Audiences are distinguished by ethnic background, by socioeconomic status, by education, by any number of things that distinguish one group of people from another group of people, even with your own family. How many different audiences are there? Just think about it. So the challenge then for effective public diplomacy is the realization that when you're projecting your messages, you're trying to influence a wide group of people. That makes it a challenge.
Maybe as well some perception of you.
Perceptions are very much part of it. For example, those images that I just showed you earlier of Ukraine, those are perceptions. You know, when people think Ukraine, they have the perception that it's Yulia Tymoshenko, or it's Holodomor, or it's Chernobyl, or it's incredible folkloric tradition, or whatever it is. Those are perceptions, and they're very difficult to manage. One more theoretical piece, and then I'll get us to some real public diplomacy. We talk all the time about globalization and innovation in information technologies. We all benefit from globalization and innovative information technologies, but that presents a tremendous challenge for effective strategic communication, public diplomacy. Why? Joseph Nye says it very well. He calls it the paradox of plenty. Plenty of information gives rise to a scarcity of attention. Plenty of information in this day and age does not give rise necessarily to increased understanding. Why? Because there is so much information out there. Information is available 24/7 from an untold number of information sources, official, unofficial, internet, television, newsprint, media, telephone. Information comes at you from every direction in every moment. And what that means is that it's very difficult then for an audience, a recipient, to decide what to pay attention to. And that's what Nye means by a scarcity of attention. It's not that people don't pay attention, it's that they're overwhelmed by the amount of data out there, and it's unclear what to choose from. Now, you here are highly educated, many of you already professionals in your field. When you turn on your computer, you go to read something or the television, or you talk to someone on the phone, you already have a pretty good idea of what news sources you trust, for example, right? And who's credible and believable, and who's not. What about people who maybe don't have the similar level of experience or professionalism or education? That's when you're talking about reaching a broad public, but a public that has so much to choose from and doesn't necessarily know how to filter or evaluate information, that becomes a challenge. And you have then multiple competitors for audience attention, so many things out there trying to get attention, multiple audiences, both intended and unintended. So, for example, if you're sending a message to one particular audience in this in global information environment, that message goes to multiple audiences, whether you meant it to or not. Multiple sets of competing values. You have the values that you project. Your intended recipient has a set of values with which he receives the message, and then there are all the other audiences out there with all their own perceptions and value systems. What that can do to our detriment is sometimes result in a reaffirmation of existing beliefs and perceptions. In other words, when there's so much information out there, what's the easiest thing to do?
Forget about it.
Or to go with something that's the most familiar. Something that you recognize. Something that conforms to a belief system that you already hold. So if the messenger is trying to change minds or change ideas, but trying to do it in this welter of information out there, it's much harder. And that can result in a narrow scope of understanding. So this is the context for strategic messaging, public diplomacy. And as you can see, it's a challenging one. All right, let's look a little bit more closely at what, let's stop here first. I've mentioned values, right? I want to give you a very short course in international relations theory. It'll only last about 2 minutes, and it's this. Public diplomacy is interest-based, objectives-driven. There is a fundamental difference between interests and objectives. And when you are doing public diplomacy and strategic communication, it is essential that you keep these two things distinct in your own mind. Why? Well, interests are values-based. They're fundamental. They're enduring. You can't buy them, you can't sell them, and you can't acquire them through power. Most countries, most entities have a similar set of values. They may involve physical security, economic prosperity, value preservation at home, or value preservation or projection abroad. Objectives, on the other hand, are specific. They're context-driven. They fulfill these interests. And how you know when you're dealing with an objective rather than an interest? Because an objective costs money and requires power. So that if a country's interest is preservation of its physical security, then it's going to have to spend money on a military campaign to repel an invasion, for example. And if a country's interest is improving economic prosperity at home, it's going to have to spend some power, some influence, and probably some money to, promote market expansion, so on and so forth. So you understand the difference, okay? In the realm of public diplomacy, then, we're talking about something that's based in interest and values, but driven by these objectives. Okay, now I'm really done with theory. So, public diplomacy. Standard definition, I've already given it to you effectively. The means by which a sovereign country, but we could also substitute institution or company, communicates with publics in other countries aimed at informing and influencing audiences for the purpose of promoting the national interest and achieving its foreign policy goals, read objectives. Okay, so how do you do that? I've talked a lot about public diplomacy this, public diplomacy that. What does it mean? In official public diplomacy, strategic communication, you can look at it is divided into 5 general areas. The focus of my comments today really are going to be about the first and second types, but it's important to understand all 5, particularly cultural diplomacy as it relates to the whole branding of a nation. So the first type is surprisingly not advocacy, listen to me, take my point, do my bidding. The first one is what? Listening. Why? Why is the first and most important thing that you can do in public diplomacy or strategic communication listening and polling? You have to learn your audience. There's a message you want to get out. If there's a product you want to sell, if there is a country you want to promote, you have to understand something about the audience toward which you are projecting that message. What are their values? What are their perceptions? How do they think about your country, your cause, your institution? And why is that important? Why is it important to know this stuff?
Because you should learn how to react on them, how to create your image, your information in a better way.
Right.
Frame your message, actually.
And to make it more
Understandable.
and attractive. To attract them. That goes back to what I said about soft power, right? Okay. All right. So listening, and that can be market surveys, it can be data collection, it can be opinion polling, all those things. You need to know your audience. Okay. Then there's advocacy, and you're here in the embassy. You have probably participated in other embassy programs. You've probably seen a few of the products that the embassy puts out in terms of press conferences, press releases, speeches. This is the short-term effort to communicate ideas and information, usually monitored by a foreign ministry at home or an embassy abroad. Then there's cultural diplomacy, and that's longer term. And that's sending abroad international art or music or dance or film so that people in other countries can learn something about your culture and, one hopes, make your country that much more attractive and understandable to them. Exchange diplomacy. I suspect there are a few of you in here who know something about exchange diplomacy. I hope so. You've participated in exchange programs, and you know what that's about. That's the opportunity to go abroad, to learn, to get new ideas, to build new networks. But the other purpose of it, the reason that, for example, the United States invests in so many scholarship programs to send people from Ukraine to the United States is because we want to promote mutual understanding. Not necessarily want to convert you to being an American, but to make our culture more accessible, attainable, and maybe even, we hope, attractive. Fundamental to exchange diplomacy. And then there are the international broadcasting entities that are parastatal, and they broadcast in the language of the target country, and there's BBC, Al Jazeera, VOA, all great examples of national enterprises that broadcast internationally in multiple languages in order to assure dissemination of ideas, information, and values. Any questions about this? Okay. All right, you're thinking to yourself, that's well and good, but how do you do public diplomacy, right? It's a little bit abstract. We're going to look at 2 examples of public diplomacy. We're going to start with the failure, because you've got to talk about failures. Why? Why are failures important?
They give you experience.
Yeah, you learn not to do it the next time. We try to learn from your mistakes, right? It's what history is supposed to tell us, but we don't do very well. In any event, let's look at a public diplomacy failure. And since it was a public diplomacy failure from my country, I feel comfortable in describing it. So, the tragic events of September 11, 2001. There was horror, of course, at the extent of the tragedy in the United States. There was shock. and there was disbelief. The headlines across the country, I kid you not, I was there, said something to the effect of, why do they hate us? Became very, very concerned about hostile Muslim world perceptions of the US in the aftermath of 9/11. Why? Well, for the threats that this perception posed to our cultural attractiveness, to our, can we, yeah, all right. Are we supposed to stop or could we keep going? Okay, so for the threats it posed to cultural, political values, and foreign policy. Recognize these categories? Where did these come from? This is a test. Soft power. Joe Nye said there were 3 categories of soft power. All of these categories were placed at risk. The United States' cultural attractiveness, its belief in faith, the importance of religion and family, its political values. We were a country of religious tolerance, of diversity, of pluralism. How could this happen? Foreign policy, or legitimacy and moral authority. This was the time in which then President Bush launched his freedom agenda, which was expansion of liberty and democracy as an alternative to terrorism. So all 3 elements were placed at risk by this negative, apparently, perception of the US. So the solution was, for a year-long period, the development of what they called the Shared Values Outreach Campaign. Now, what does the title Shared Values already tell you about the intent of this campaign?
To talk about different values, to exchange thoughts, first of all. Like
To talk
cut
about
down the
values,
emotions.
to cut down the emotions. Exactly.
Why did the belief that Muslims hate Americans?
What about the shared part?
Like, 2 nations have the same values.
Yes. We're just like you. You know, we Americans are just like your Muslim. We care about faith and family. You know, we believe in diversity, pluralism. Coordinated by State Department. Target audience, roughly Muslim world. Message. America is a country of faith and family where Muslims can live in peace and prosperity. And here's a picture taken from that time. You see the young ladies here, young Muslim American women, eating something. I think they're breaking their fast at iftar in New Jersey. So this is an image that captures a lot of this, right? The tolerance, the diversity, the faith. Program tools, they had market-tested TV and newspaper advertising campaigns, mass media placements. There were videos, pictures, stories, all promoting this narrative. Now let's talk about the outcome. Guess what? It didn't work. It did not work. Why didn't it work? Well, I told you that the first step toward effective public diplomacy was listening. We didn't listen right because we didn't ask the right question. The question we need, our assumption was that we were at risk, our values, our culture, our foreign policy was at risk because Muslims didn't like American values. But was that the issue? No. What was the issue? Our policy. So we built a whole campaign around a faulty assumption that if we could only get through to the Muslims of the world, that we were a country that believes in faith, family, tolerance, things would be all right. Well, that was never the issue. It was never a hatred of America or Americans. It was a discomfort with our policies. And at the time, it was Iraq, It was our support for Israel in the Israeli-Palestine conflict. It was the presence of our troops in countries like Saudi Arabia, which is the home to Mecca, and many other ways in which U.S. policy and U.S. behavior did not conform to expectations of the Muslim world. But we asked the wrong question, and we didn't do enough listening. Okay, let's look at a success now. Rebranding Switzerland. Now, in the late 1990s, there were a number of books and articles that revealed that during the war, Switzerland housed in its banks Nazi gold. Gold, the Nazi banks, right. I mean, Switzerland was and still continues to be, I think, in many ways, a repository for Europe, if not the world, its banking sector. So, but in the 1990s, there was a sort of a whole series of articles and books that depicted, as you can see in this cartoon here, the Matterhorn opens up, and what do you find inside? Nazi gold. Now, this was a problem for Switzerland. Why? Why should Switzerland care?
It affected its international image.
Exactly. It threatened its cultural attractiveness. It put it at risk. It likes to be known as a country of tolerance and ethical behavior. Not depicted here. Its political values were betrayed. It liked to think of itself as a country that was transparent, modern, and committed to humanitarian support. And its foreign policy and very legitimacy and moral authority were at risk because its foreign policy is neutrality, and its economic base is, its banking sector and its financial integrity. What would happen, the Swiss worried, if people seeing this, what would their partners, what might they decide to do? Not invest, right? They had a problem. This image ran the risk of hurting what was most important to it. What else does Switzerland have besides banks and its neutrality? Mountains and chocolate. Okay, but do you see my point? This neutrality in this banking sector, that was essential to their survival as a nation, as they saw it. So they had to do something about it, right? They had to do something about their image. So they created Presence Switzerland in 2000. And this was just a group, a collective of government, public and private sector representatives and stakeholders who got together to decide, all right, how are we going to control this narrative or take back control of this narrative? And then they decided, first of all, that they needed to figure out who they needed to reach. So they started by putting out surveys and polls in their key partner countries to find out what people were actually thinking of Switzerland. What were their perceptions? What were their concerns about their relationship with Switzerland? So they started by listening. They decided on a message, sort of an internal message, which was joint action, joint promotion. And based on their surveys, they put a lot of emphasis on participation in global exhibits. And by that I mean exhibits that would surround international sports competitions, global trade exhibits, global fairs, a number of these, where you get a number of nations together for usually either commercial or sporting reasons, sometimes cultural, and a number of countries put up booths or pavilions at these events. Switzerland took it to the next level. And here is an example from 2004, I think. It's in a World Trade Expo in Japan. It recreated, this is the digital image, it recreated the Matterhorn, smaller scale, a peak that people could walk inside and look around and see different things. I used this particular image because I like the fact that they went from the bad mountain to the good mountain. And in each of these exhibits, they put Swiss nationals who talked about their country. There were There was all kinds of information available, promoted tourism. And in the end, over time, and they discovered this through continuing to do active listening, opinions of Switzerland started to change for the better. Now, I want to make it clear that it was not solely because of the activities of present Switzerland. What happened in Switzerland was also very important. Legislation changed, and banking practices changed to sort of tighten up controls on the kind of financial instruments that they could store and the conditions under which they could store these financial instruments. So Switzerland cleaned up its act a little bit in terms of its banking sector regulations, and that also contributed. But this is an example of a successful public diplomacy campaign, a successful nation branding campaign. In fact, this is a pure nation branding, because that was the whole purpose here, was to restart and recreate the image of Switzerland in the minds of Switzerland's most important partners. Okay. All right. Now we're getting closer to brass tacks. How do you build a country brand? I could substitute public diplomacy for a country here. I could substitute strategic communication. Still be the same thing. How do you go about doing that? Well, first thing is you decide what your strategic objectives are, and you do that based on what your values or interests are, and how these values are threatened, or maybe where there might be opportunities to promote them. Then you comprehend, you understand the attitudes and cultures of your target audiences. And you think about contemporary media and communication trends and how that can affect the way in which people perceive you. You come up with a plan and you put it together. You implement it through engagement, dialogue, through influence and advocacy activities. And you're always assessing, evaluating, and you're always ready to adapt. In fact, this process, although I have it in a step-by-step, if you can tell from the more or less evenly placed arrows, it is a continuous process. Okay, this seems a little bit abstract, doesn't it? So let's look at it using our Swiss example. They'll have the slides. So Switzerland went from Nazi gold, the image of Nazi gold, to the image of Swiss technology and innovation. They decided that the values that they wanted to focus on: tolerance, diversity, tradition. They saw the threats to their neutrality and their financial integrity, but they also saw opportunities, right? In the process of doing this was a way also not only to gain back positive impressions of Switzerland, but maybe to expand them, maybe to gain new opportunities to do business. So they researched attitudes and discovered the perception that the Swiss placed financial gain above ethical considerations was hurting them. And looking at media communication trends, they decided that they would build their brand recognition in the global marketplace through these global exhibits. Their plan, as I said, was present Switzerland, joint action, joint promotion. The foreign ministry, banking, business, media, culture, sports, tourism, youth affairs, they were all involved in the decision making. They all had stakes. They were all stakeholders in Switzerland's image. And the strategy, one of the strategies, the principal one, was exhibits in key partner countries. So then they implemented it. They put these exhibits together. They spent a lot of money on them. And these exhibits provided a first-hand look at Swiss culture society in Tokyo, in Geneva, in Sydney. In other words, people could go to these exhibits and get a sense of Switzerland without having to, go further than maybe 20 or 30 miles from their home. They brought Switzerland to the world. And the influence aspect, to get people to understand the Swiss as a modern, tolerant, open society. And then all the time, they kept up the assessments, the polling, the media analysis, and evaluation. And the plan was open to, it was structured such that it was very easy to change course if they needed to change course. So any questions about this process or how Switzerland used this process to their advantage? Yeah.
I have a question, but I think one of the disadvantages of this system was that it lost the image of the country that doesn't ask people about how did they get the money. So I think they lost a lot of money on this point. Exactly.
In the short term, they did, yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. In the case of Switzerland, it was the Ministry of Foreign Affairs working with government leadership, saying we've got to come up with a solution. And then I'm not sure who had the idea of President Switzerland, but it was government sanctioned. It was run by a senior diplomat, but the senior diplomat was given a fair amount of autonomy in how he put his team together. In the case of the Muslim outreach, it was put together by Department of State, the Public Diplomacy Division, in consultation with other agencies.
Can you share a little more about 7 image surveys in K-target countries? How they did this assess?
I don't know the details on the surveys, but generally, I'm pretty sure they employed pollsters, market surveyors, and there are global institutions, Pew and others. For a fee, will go anywhere in the world to do surveys. You tell them what it is you want to know. They are experts at formulating questions, and the great institutions like Pew will use local partners who understand the local scene in order to carry it out. And they're not cheap, but they're well worth it. Okay, so that's Switzerland. Now let's talk about Ukraine. As you correctly said at the very beginning, it's all about perceptions. And when you're thinking about building an image or a brand of a country, you need to think about how others perceive you, what your audience thinks. This is something called the Good Country Index. It's fairly new. It was put together by the experts who really kind of invented the nation branding index. And the philosophy behind the Good Country Index is this. It measures the global impacts of a country's policies and behaviors, what it contributes to the global commons or the common good, and what it takes away. It's designed to encourage populations and their governments to be more outward-looking and to consider the international consequences of their national behavior. So it's a metric, an index that's designed not to measure actual behavior so much as perceptions of that behavior. Now, there are a number of great indices and surveys out there. You're probably familiar with a number of them. The Fragile States Index, the World Bank Ease of Doing Business, Transparency International, Freedom House. All of these indices are very useful, actually, if you're trying to get kind of a snapshot of where your country stands in terms of other countries. But the Good Country Index is most interesting because of the way it measures perceptions. So out of 125 countries, Ukraine is 99 out of 125. Now, you've got some low scores here. And the lowest, not surprisingly, is planet and climate. And remember what was one of the images I used at the beginning? Chernobyl. People still think Chernobyl. It's actually based on measurements such as biocapacity reserve, hazardous waste exports, organic water pollutants, CO2 emissions, and other greenhouse gas emissions. But here is where the surprising figure comes for Ukraine. Number 13 out of 125 in science and technology. International students, journal exports, international publications, Nobel Prizes, and patents. You guys do very, very well. So this is an interesting display of perceived strengths and perceived weaknesses. This is my own redoing of the chart because I wanted to put Ukraine in context with some of your neighbors. So I have Russia there, so Ukraine is 99, Russia is 95, Belarus 82, Poland 52, 60, and 65 overall. But in science and technology, you're higher than any of them. In a pretty high-level science and technology, I mean, most of it, not surprising given Soviet legacy, the other kind, your neighbors do quite well in that category, but none as well as Ukraine. You do pretty well comparatively on culture and world order, and like a number of your neighbors, the whole prosperity, the planet and climate and international peace and security sort of lower on the spectrum. Not unsurprising. So what if you were to decide to brand Ukraine? What if you picked one of these values, let's say prosperity and equality, how would you put together a brand? How would you advise your Ministry of Foreign Affairs to improve the world's perception of Ukraine's viability as a place of prosperity, a place where people should invest? Because, in fact, the evaluators for prosperity and equality are open trading, UN volunteers abroad, fair trade market size, and foreign direct investment outflows. Let's say you wanted to improve Ukraine's image as a place to invest. How would you do that?
Decrease corruption.
Well, that's a tall order. Is that the first place you would start with the strategic communication plan? Yeah.
I think what the first thing for us is to ensure our Western partners that we are going to implement all the reforms in the economic life of our country, and for this to achieve, to attain money from the international funds in order to improve the economic situation in our country.
That's true, and you've sort of encompassed a number of things in that comment. You've sort of settled on the fact that there is a particular value, Ukraine's basic reliability and credibility that you want to project. You understand that perceptions of that, of that financial strength and financial credibility are a little bit weak, and you need to persuade your partners of it. So far, so good. What might be something that you could do to illustrate that Ukraine is a place, for example, that foreign countries might want to invest in?
We can show our strengths. For example, it's natural resources for clever people who work in IT sphere, and talk about like some successes in these industries, how people like foreign investors or Ukrainian people invested money in some startups or some ventures, and eventually they made good money or achieved some results. So we can start it from showing that what we have, how we can develop it, and what outcomes we can reach.
You're right, and the most important word you used was success and success stories. If you want to talk about Ukraine as a place to invest, you have to gather the data, of course, that indicates that it is a good investment, and then you have to get stories out about successful investments. There was a comment here.
About investments, I think that it's possible to have an investment when we don't have any electronic sign.
Any what? I'm sorry?
Electronic sign. signature. So we can't integrate.
Electronic signature.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I understand.
Officially, but any investigation we have.
Oh, you mean in terms of the technical?
Yes.
Okay. Is that a question? Is that something that is under discussion by the government?
Yes.
So one thing you could say to an investor who says, you know, you don't have that electronic signature, you can say, that's true, but our legislature is looking at implementing it.
But
Okay.
it's not so actual question as, for example, some political issues for elections and so on, and our government, they focus now only on this, but not on our real investment problems. And I have a question. Can I have a question for you?
Of course.
About current situation of political diplomacy and public diplomacy in Ukraine. How do you think, in Ukraine, what should we do? What variant is more efficient to make public diplomacy as separated part of official diplomacy, standard diplomacy, or to make it as, to promote it as a part of it? To separate or to do it as a
I think you do both. I mean, you do official public diplomacy, but every time one of you goes abroad to participate in a program or to work for a company, you're also doing public diplomacy. Every time an NGO engages with a Western partner, that's a form because you're representing Ukraine. In general, though, I think in terms of public diplomacy for Ukraine, I would say overall, official public diplomacy, not talking about specific issues here, it goes back to what I said at the opening of this lecture, which is finding ways to project Ukraine's strengths and potential and its values, and sending, getting its ministers abroad to talk to audiences, getting its embassies to promote actively on its behalf, making a concerted effort to think about what kind of Ukraine do you want the rest of the world to see? Making a decision about what that Ukraine looks like and then promoting it actively. The challenge here is not the promotion. The challenge is in identifying what is the Ukraine of the future? What is the Ukraine, the partner that we want the rest of the world to see? And that definition is up to you as Ukrainians. But that's how it has to happen. Because there's a world that is open to you right now. There's a world that is sympathetic. And that's where it has to happen. Yeah.
To my mind, no one will invest their money into the country which is not safe. So as we can't stop the war at once, we can see it through the Minsk agreements or their implementation, we should create some insurance funds for international investitions with a state guarantee where World Bank or international monetary fund will be involved in that fund. So we must make image that in our country your money will be safe, and you, if the war continues and your some manufacture projects or some other will fail, you will get your money back through the insurance funds.
So you would focus the campaign on this particular issue.
The safety of money.
Yep. Okay. And that makes sense. Clearly, you can't take on the whole question of prosperity in one campaign. You have to break it down and identify what part of it you want to tackle, and that's a good one. If you could come up and make that change for me. So I was meeting with the press secretary of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs today. And I told him that I was going to be talking about Ukraine public diplomacy branding. And he said, oh, that's interesting because I've just created a brand for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Have any of you seen this?
No.
Yes.
Yeah?
Yes.
Right?
And it deals with the shape of the ministry itself.
That's right.
Yeah.
So Ukraine, our boat, our vessel, Why are you guys laughing? This is serious. The Titanic. In the image business, you do have to watch what you say. No, this is not compelling. You have to translate this for me. Something the people. The will of the people is our wind. The will of the people. So, our nation is our boat. The will of the people is our wind. And you're laughing too? Believe me, I'm not going to tell him how you responded.
You should tell. It's better to tell about Titanic as well.
All right, well, let's I seriously want to talk about your reaction, but let's finish the slides, okay? That's the shape of the ministry. Yeah, that's the ministry right there, and so that's the shape. And that is the image for the, for the thing. And there it is. That part's good. You don't like the ship? Okay. All right, now let's analyze this now in terms of what we were talking about. We'll start here with the beautiful ship. Why were you laughing?
Small.
It's small. The ship is small. Okay, so if he'd had a gigantic cruise liner, it would have been a better...
Military cruise liner.
Or a warship.
Yeah.
But but this is serious. Is that the image you want to project of Ukraine as a warship? No.
May I just explain what I see? Just the thing is that the boat like that with the wind, so it means that someone has to push it always. So, and if there is a storm on I don't know, in the ocean or someone, so it's always, unstable. And actually, it's the project how Ukraine is unstable in this respect.
Yeah, well,
now.
I don't know a
So
single
this
country
5%.
that has smooth sailing.
Yeah.
If I could say that. I mean, all countries
but
are
still.
subject to storms and, okay. So you think that it suggests instability, okay?
Well, the image is okay and the concept may be very good, but this particular image of this boat is like very, very romantic. Like you watching it and you, only Miami comes to your mind, not Ukraine. It's like for the people who really live in Ukraine, it doesn't look like
Okay,
making sense.
but who is this campaign intended for?
Foreigners.
Okay. And you don't think that it's credible?
And we have a sea, but we do not identify ourselves as a sea country. And we have problems in our sea. So it's again, one more time reminds about these problems which we have in the sea.
What values do you think that this campaign is trying to project?
Freedom, prosperity,
Okay, so where do we see freedom?
wind,
Wind, open sea, okay? Prosperity, how does it project prosperity? I guess you can afford a boat like that?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, actually, this brand was elaborated before we lost Crimea. Actually, it's like more than a year.
It's still being used, though. Yeah. So you think that after Crimea, it would be a rowboat? Yeah. Yeah.
But still, it reminds us of that, loss.
Yeah.
And to my mind, the second motto that our nation is our wind, it suggests the democracy, so that the will of the nation is always
Driving the ship.
Yeah.
And you disagree with that?
It's written in our constitution.
So that's okay. That's good. This is good. All right. All right. Now let's move to the one that really got you laughing.
that's very good.
All right. Okay. I don't know. I was under the impression that integration with EU was something that was desirable. Am I wrong?
No, it's not desirable.
Europe, it's about our
It's about ministry.
It's about MFA actually. Yes.
We are very skeptical about our ministry.
So okay. So you don't have confidence. The ministry as an entity doesn't have the credibility to sustain this statement. Okay.
And I don't know how the others, but to my mind, this motto looks like old Soviet mottos about when the party is son of nation or some others. It seems too old for some government institution to take for that some romantic association with it.
Oh, I don't know. I think back to my recent political history of my country. I think, yes, we can, or 1,000 points of light. Is that not slogan-y and romantic?
Yes, it's rather romantic, but after the Soviet Union, most of people think this to be too much.
Okay, so you think no slogan at all, or a different kind of slogan, or you're just off of slogans?
Different kind of slogan.
A different. All right, what would be a good slogan?
Without mentioning any government
Yes.
institution at all.
Without any means.
Okay, this is interesting. So, okay, and what does that say about you as a people? What value does that reflect about you, this comment? Talk about yourself.
Independence.
Kind of an independence, huh?
We don't work our governmental institutions.
We are able to control our government and change the power in our country.
You feel that you can, or you feel that you can't?
We are
You are able, okay? All right, but back to the guy who doesn't like the slogan. I buy that. But what would be a slogan? What phrase, what expression would for you capture the spirit of your country? And remember, this is for an external campaign, right? So this is for the rest of the world to see. How would you frame it in a few words? That sounds pretty Soviet to me. I mean, if we're going to do this whole Soviet thing. Now, mind you, the slogan business is hard, but anyone else want to give it a try?
What's our goal? Should we say about Europe or should we say about our institutions? Yeah, it's up to us.
Tell me.
I would erase from this slogan the last word, like it brings us home, because a lot of people don't think like our home in Europe. They think our home in Ukraine, actually.
So you don't like it.
No, I would just say like the will of our people is what brings us to Europe, without to home.
But you like it. Why?
I like it.
Why?
Because I think that it's very correct message. We should say like this. We should think with this, and we should share this message inside the country as well.
But we are limiting ourselves only to the European countries.
Okay. Yes.
I think that we are now making a mistake, I mean, me and the audience, in the way that we try to reflect this motto on us. How do we feel about it? But we should understand what society and what world expect from us. So in an international environment, Minister of Foreign Affairs is the representative of the country who is delivering the message to the audience and to all the world. So this is pretty good motto for them, because they trust that Minister of Foreign Affairs is the institution that would lead the country and represent there. So it's pretty good. And for them, bringing us to home proves that Ukraine actually wants to go to Europe.
She's absolutely right about the external nature of this message. But what did I just tell you at the very beginning of this lecture? I said it's so hard to disentangle your values from what you see. And you see, you just proved that. Your own perceptions and values and expectations immediately got tangled in the way in which you responded to this thing. So, but okay, let's take that. Now, put on your take off your Ukraine hat just for a moment. I know it's hard to do under these circumstances, but just for a moment, and put on your citizen of the world hat. Try to imagine yourselves not Ukrainian. You've spent time overseas, right, overseas, abroad. So do you think this is a credible external message? Yes, why?
because it's short.
Well, short,
Yes.
yes, short can enhance credibility sometimes, but what else? Yeah.
Maybe like if you switch the parts, like I think there is a trend in the world that a lot of people don't like governments, and a lot of investors they don't like governments as well. So like it should be emphasized on that we are going to Europe, and yes, okay, MZS will help you. Like they are servants, they will help you somehow.
Mm-hmm.
So it can be okay for foreigners,
Mm-hmm.
but anyway, I feel that even for them it can be too much of this. Like they are our.
Давай, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Actually, I have the opposite opinion. I think that people in Europe and the United States of America are more used to trust the government, to trust their ministries, to trust in some ways. Yes, and
Well, I have another American colleague here who can join in. Not necessarily. But
so it's like 50-50, but in Ukraine we are not used to trust our government.
that's true.
Like,
That's true. And that's actually a legacy that a number of countries in the region have to struggle with. Yes?
I think it's good point not for the people from other countries, but from international institutions. And actually, I think it's a good point that Ministry of Foreign Affairs are this part because it represents that Ministry of Foreign Affairs have influence of all country and represent the will of all people. So for them, it's important to understand when we talk with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we talk with all Ukraine. It's not just some deputies, ministers, and the country have another will.
I think just to advertise our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, this motto might be good, but if we think more abstract on this, then we may come to an opinion that only Ministry of Foreign Affairs is the only institution that helps us to go to the European Union and not people. This may be also.
And that's a good point. And actually, I asked the press secretary about this. You know, he said, he said there was talk of trying actually to come up with a collective slogan, a joint, one slogan for the government of Ukraine as opposed to just for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But he said here was the problem. It would take so long to get agreement, if you could even get agreement amongst the various competing audiences, institutions, perceptions, and values held by each of these institutions. He didn't say all that part, I did, to reinforce the teaching points. They decided, what the heck, let's just do the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and you guys, I hope you come up with something later. Now, and I don't mean to be disparaging, I mean, he wanted to come up with an image for the ministry, and he also recognized that it would be impossible to come up with a collective image. And actually, I think about the United States, I don't know how we would ever agree in the United States on one way to describe our country. The slogans that I just parroted to you, yes we can, and 1,000 points of light, are associated with particular presidents, administrations, and political parties. They don't necessarily represent all of America. So, but that's one of the challenges when you're trying to project who your nation is and what your nation represents, is coming up with a way to articulate it that represents all interests and all perspectives. And the answer is very difficult to do. So, okay, I think how are we doing on time?
We have about
15 minutes left. Okay. Any other questions or comments on this?
Okay.
Yeah.
Going back to the question about responsibility of institutions who are responsible for information policy.
Mm-hmm.
Well, in Ukraine, we just have this Ministry for Information created,
Mm-hmm.
like very recently. And I want to ask you about the experience of the United States as you work in USIA, and it doesn't exist anymore. Like, what other bodies or bureaus or departments of the Department of State exist, how they collaborate, and like, who is the main decision maker in those agencies? well, who takes the last say? That will be like this program will go or not. Does they depend on the president or of the secretary of state? Well, how they collaborate, how those programs got adopted.
When we are talking about cultural programs or programs within the purview of the United States, the decision-making chain is all within the Department of State. So, for example, there's a decision to, I don't know, do a new cultural exchange program with China, or to launch a series of short-term international visitor programs for citizens of Afghanistan. At that level, all of the decision-making is made internal to the State Department, and actually probably below the Secretary of State, maybe up to the level of the Undersecretary, particularly when it involves high-value, high-target countries like Afghanistan or China. But when we're talking about a policy, a national policy objective, State Department is only one of the players in the interagency process that goes into both the decision-making about the policy and also the decision-making about the messaging that will surround it. So that in this day and age, let's say when we're talking about, well, let's take the tragic events in Benghazi. When we were trying to come up with a coordinated response to what happened at that, you know the events I'm talking about, when the U.S. facility there was attacked, four Americans died. The process of responding to this, to create talking points of general use, involved State Department, it involved the CIA, it involved the Department of Justice, to some degree Secret Service, and White House. And every one of these stakeholders had something to say about how we could publicly discuss the events of Benghazi. And interestingly enough, in the process, originally, the institution that was wanted to be most transparent was the CIA. They wanted to include a lot of detail. But as the talking points were reviewed, agency by agency by agency, the end result was a set of talking points that had very little information, because they came up against that tension that your own government actually faces every day when talking about the ceasefire or ceasefire violations. How you balance the need to be transparent and reasonably credible and believable on the one hand, and on the other hand, operational security, or in this case, saying too much about the events in Benghazi might compromise the criminal investigation, any activities that intelligence agencies might have used to, track down the culprits. And in the end, in this interagency process, the final arbiter of which was the NSC, the National Security Council is the final arbiter in these cases, ultimately approved the final set of talking points. The problem in that particular instance was they erred on the side, I think, of too little information. And when Ambassador Rice took those talking points out on the talk shows a day later, well, it really was the end of her career. She didn't come across as credible. She was a little bit inconsistent, and that's in large measure due to the fact that she wasn't given enough information to talk credibly on 6 major television and news outlets about what happened. She lost credibility, and the administration lost credibility. Did the interagency do anything wrong? No. CIA was standing up for its equities, State Department stood up for its equities, Justice stood up for its equities. They were all doing what they were charged to do under their terms of their mission. But in the end, they came up with something that ultimately damage the credibility. So that's kind of a long answer to your question. So it is, when you're talking about issues of national concern that touch basic national interests as well as objectives, it's an interagency process on the strategic communication process with all of the relevant agencies involved. And the National Security Council at this point, and it ebbs and flows depending on the administration, has kind of the final call on how it's articulated. So it's a process that, the process itself worked, but the product was, because of the constraints of the process, not something that we wanted. I think that's a personal, private view of how it happened.
Those programs, I mean, in strategic communication, for example, you mentioned about campaign shared values, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who was responsible for elaborating this campaign?
State Department, public diplomacy.
So
But one thing I didn't, more detail on this. This was actually, it was the new undersecretary at the time, Charlotte Beers. She was a Madison Avenue advertising executive. I think one of her best campaigns was Uncle Ben's Rice, for those of you who know Rice, Uncle Ben. Yeah, she was, back in the day, the copywriter that came up with Uncle Ben's Rice. And with the dissolution of USIA, they were searching around for someone who could run the public diplomacy arm of State Department. And they said, well, marketing executive, that should work. The Shared Values campaign was essentially a pure marketing campaign. Nothing wrong with that, except that the listening strategies that perhaps you use for an advertising campaign may need to be different from the kind of listening and research strategies that you need to use for a campaign that is going to be used to influence foreign audiences. So in that case, that particular campaign was influenced by a relatively new head of the public diplomacy division, someone who did not come to the job from diplomacy, but came to it from marketing, business, advertising. And that influenced the way in which way this program rolled out. That said, as I said, it only lasted about a year. It, figured it out, and we started actually to build in a number of new exchange programs, outreach programs that have been, I think, certainly more effective than that. And we learned a hard lesson in the process. Any other questions? Yeah. Questions, comments? Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question on this presentation and just this message also. I'm just interested in how this message will be perceived in other parts of the world, like Asia, Latin America, Africa. So Ukraine is going to Europe, but they will think maybe, okay, they are going to Europe, they don't care about Asia or like India, Brazil, I don't know, other countries, so they don't want to deal with us, maybe. What do you think about that?
I don't think it's quite as drastic as all that. I think that the other countries in the world are sophisticated enough to understand that Ukraine needs partners in the region to help stabilize it, to help bring its economy back in line. And I don't think that they would be offended if they see that Ukraine is turning to the nearest strong partner to try to get some support to move forward. And I think, yes, I was at a meeting today, and I heard that the Chinese are offering scholarships to Ukraine.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think the rest of the world, as I said earlier, I think the rest of the world looks at Ukraine and sees a country, in a serious, a profound struggle for its sovereignty and for its future. And I think the feeling in general is, if not of solidarity, it is certainly of sympathy and concern, which, by the way, I share. So I wish you all extremely well. I'm very honored, actually, to be here in Ukraine at this time, at this moment of crisis, when all of you are doing so much, and it's all of you as well as everybody else, to make sure that the future of this country is strong, and it will be a country that will survive and prosper. So I wish you all the best in that endeavor. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Our tradition to take a group picture.
Okay.
I think this is good.
Oh, shall I move my stuff out? Yeah. You don't want a picture of my bag. Oh, sorry. Is it? I'm talking. Yeah.
Just take it off.